All right, y'all. Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And I'm here with Dr. Lisa. How are you doing? How is the weather? How's all the things?
All the things. Hi, everyone. Lisa Ingarfield, she, hers. Um, yeah, things are good. I discovered a bounty of tomatoes in my backyard because I just moved and there is a garden area, but I am not currently watering the garden area. And I just assumed that there was nothing alive. And then I went in there to get a tennis ball for Comet. And
Yeah.
I discovered like hundreds of ripe tomatoes. So,
Oh, that's awesome.
and more growing and green, right?
Hmm.
So I've
Hmm.
spent the day making marinara, fresh marinara sauce that I am freezing. So I shall continue to do that until the freeze comes.
Hmm. Oh, that is a lovely discovery because I have very fond memories of my grandmother making the tomato base for all different types of soups and sauces and just her whole canning process, the science behind all of that, which is really cool. But then, there's nothing like a tomato and cucumber and onion salad with something, just for no reason. Like that's always a good side. So oh, that is a lucky discovery there. Okay, you're going to be eating good for a while there, so that's good. Um,
I know, yeah.
oh, yeah, that's great. So, all right, well, let's dive into our word of the week. And as usual, we provide you with the word of the week, and it will make much more sense as we start getting into our various phases for today. But our word of the week or concept of the week is reparation. Reparation. Okay. And I know because I'm saying this word out loud in a US context, people's minds may go in a particular direction, but let me kind of define things more broadly and then we can certainly filter down. But a reparation is making amends for one's wrongdoing by paying money to or otherwise helping those who have been wronged. Okay. And I know that it's been a word that's come up for quite a while. Lisa, I don't know if you remember when there was this consortium that was created of colleges and universities that wanted to start exploring the history and the archives around how their institutions may have been built upon the work and the enslavement of Black people. And so they kind of created a consortium to do that research so that they then could lead to some form of acknowledgement, whether it was an apology, reparations, or otherwise. Well, reparations are interesting because it is a way to acknowledge and hopefully begin the repair process for the consequences of violating human rights. Now, what's interesting though, Lisa, is that there are lots of places that have already done this type of work, including obviously South Africa is probably the best example, and many people use the South African model of reparations as the model for themselves. Um, and at the same time, it gets interesting, right? Because what happens when it's either reparations and an apology or reparations and no apology, or let's just jump over it. And like a lot of people said here in the US, let's just jump over reparations and go straight to Juneteenth. Like there's so many different variables that come with thinking about reparations. We even bid on a potential project. This was a couple years ago around exploring reparations in particular counties. And so, given this, Lisa, I know this is a very divisive topic for folks that don't want to embrace history and the trickle down effects of history, but here we are still thinking about how this could be applicable to our US experience.
Yeah, and it does take on a particular meaning in the US, in the US context, obviously, as it relates to descendants of enslaved people here. I think it's interesting because reparations, presumably from the word repair, right? Like, how do we repair a harm that has been done? And to think that generational harm and the ongoing abuse, discrimination, oppression of a particular group of people can be repaired with a Sorry. You know, like it's
Yeah.
not that that
Yeah.
shouldn't be a part of it, but to think that would be sufficient, and we haven't even gotten there, right? Like federally, there has not been an apology, I don't believe.
Oh yeah, there was an apology,
Okay.
but here's the thing though, Lisa, to your great point, I think your thinking is leading where most people lead because it was just words as an apology, but not
Hmm.
any form of payment. Was it really an apology? So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think there is a lot here, and we'll touch a little bit on it
yeah,
later in the show. But reparation,
yeah.
it's
Mhm.
definitely something for us to think about. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is an author here in the United States, 10 years ago he wrote a piece for the Atlantic, and we will include that link in our show notes. The case for reparations. I can't believe it was 10 years ago. Actually, I keep referencing that piece, and then I just realized it
Yes.
was 2014. So holy cow.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, anyone who reads it will see that it's still extremely relevant, like he wrote it yesterday. So, yeah, take a look at that, the case for reparations. Also, too, as I was doing some research a couple of summers ago, there's a great book called "Dear Church," a love letter from a black preacher to the whitest denomination in the U.S. And they have an entire chapter in that book specifically that speaks to reparations. So we can get into that a little bit more, but there's a lot of good pieces that they pontificate on the what ifs. What if we actually did a federal reparation? What if we don't? So I think we should at least grapple with it a bit. But anyway, let me get into phase one, Lisa, because let me tell you how super excited I was when I saw this email come across earlier this week. And again, another rabbit trail that I followed, not knowing that it was going to be such a big deal. So, my boys go to school in Anne Arundel County, which is only a few miles from where I live. I live in Prince George's County. But my boys go in Anne Arundel County and they have a really strong public library system. And I mean, it's incredible. Some of the models that they've created have become national models. And it's literally not even a block away from the boys' dad. So they go there, like the bus drops kids off there after school. Like it's truly a central hub of the area. And so anyway, I got this email because I'm on the email listserv for Anne Arundel County Public Schools. And Anne Arundel Public Libraries have become the first library system in the state of Maryland designated as a book sanctuary. All right. Now, for those who have been listeners for a while, you know how many times Dr. Lisa and I have brought up how much we cannot stand book banning and how it occurs all across the country. And I never thought of, again, not being a librarian and not being part of the library systems, I never thought about what could be done from a social justice perspective to combat specifically the book banning in a systemic way, right? Now, all of us can be pissed off and all of us can try to intercept or intervene when someone tries to ban a book and starts that process. I did not realize that an entire library system can reject the notion of book banning. Super cool. And so when I looked at the history of how this came about, this actually only started 2 years ago in Chicago, where Chicago Public Libraries kind of created a model of book sanctuaries. And book sanctuaries are places that are dedicated to collecting and protecting endangered books. So then those books are more broadly accessible. They even host events around those books, like book talks and events, and even book signings when it's possible to educate people on both the books themselves as well as the history of book banning and book burning. I'm like, whoa, this is super cool. And so there was an announcement made that our county is the first in the state. Lots of executives came on board to make sure that it was a high profile event in regards to announcing this. And so, what I thought was pretty cool, Lisa, was that again, I already knew about Banned Books Week, which is a really cool week long opportunity to highlight banned books. But again, Lisa, you and I, we talk about systemic issues all the time. And so I was so pleasantly surprised to see a systemic interruption or disruption to the book banning in such a way that this could be replicated all over the country. So anyway, Lisa, super excited. I hope this
Yeah.
becomes a model for the
Hmm.
rest of the state, and just continues to spread like wildfire on this. But yeah, it was pretty cool to see.
You know what's interesting to me is when we talk about book banning, we've largely chatted about it in relation to Florida and some other southern states. And I wasn't really thinking that Maryland would be a state that would be afflicted with requests for book banning. Not to say that everyone in Maryland is, super progressive. I understand there's a diversity of opinions there, but I was really surprised to read in that email that more than half of Maryland's public libraries have Facebook challenges. And have experienced a 600% increase in staff threats, including 11 bomb threats, right? So this is a state that is certainly not one that I would consider red or very conservative. And so that makes me wonder what is the reality down in states where there's a lot more aggression and fervor around book banning, and whether this concept of a book sanctuary could even happen in a different political climate. Like could a library district do that in Mississippi, for example? Like, I wonder how viable that would be. It's funny also because I was listening to a Code Switch podcast, which is one of our fave podcasts, a couple of weeks ago, and the host, B.A. Parker, was talking to her teacher, who, from a long time ago, right? It was a really cool discussion between her as the past student and the teacher, and talking about the Hate U Give, which is a book that she read in class, and B.A. Parker was just talking about the impact that had, and the teacher. I'm going to get the details wrong, I think, here, because as I'm thinking about it as I'm speaking, I'm not 100% sure if the teacher was a teacher or a librarian, but they are now connected to a library where they have just essentially made it just for adults. So they have all the books, and you have to be an adult to access the library. If you're an adult and a parent and you want to check a library book out and take it to your child, then that is your prerogative to do, right? But like, there's no access for under 18-year-olds to this library as a means to sidestep these issues around book banning, right? Because they're all around young people, right? Like, we can't have young children reading these books about gay families or racism,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it might hurt their
Mm-hmm.
feelings. So
Mm-hmm.
that was
Mm-hmm.
another, it's not a book sanctuary, but it was a different way of addressing those bans. And I don't know, I don't remember where that was, what state that was, but just a couple
Oh,
of thoughts that I had on looking at this book sanctuary piece.
wow, that's it. Well, and again, the s- I'm just going to say censorship, especially the way that ALA describes it, the American Library Association describes it. They have a wonderful, I call it the Wolf Blitzer magic map, like when it's election season, where they have a map that shows each year. You can hover over each state to see how many have been banned. And if you look comparatively over the last 10 years or so, the country overall gets not politically redder, but it does get redder and redder as far as the egregiousness of the number of book bans. So, in, maybe 10 years ago, there might have been less than 10 books banned in most states. But as folks are becoming more educated, and I would suggest this being parallel to the awareness of DEI, George Floyd in particular, you see the numbers like skyrocket on certain books that are banned. So, for example, just for Maryland alone, to your point around, I wouldn't have imagined Maryland, there's only been in Maryland 13 attempts to restrict access to books, and 140 or so of those were challenged, but to no avail, right? Well, then you compare that to the states that we have talked about, right? So Maryland 13, 148, Florida 33, 2,672. So, we're not overstating the data point. We're just simply saying that all book bans are rising. It doesn't seem as if any state is exempt, because I haven't yet found one state that had zero in regards to attempts to ban books. But I think what's really powerful about this is that, yeah, we might be low on the attempts to book ban, but I feel like Maryland is staying vigilant for anyone who might try it. And so I appreciate the systemic aspect of this. And you're right.
Mm,
How that would land in Florida, Texas, Mississippi,
yeah.
Louisiana, mm, I don't know. I don't know how it will be received. I've been doing some work building out a training, and we as Maryland are usually ranked very highly by Human Rights Campaign and several other national large polls as being the friendliest to particular populations, whether it's the friendliest to African Americans specifically, because we have so much Black history here, the friendliest to LGBTQ plus populations. We rank pretty highly on a lot of those national surveys, but at the same time, it ain't all roses around here either, Lisa, because if you go into certain areas of the state, the feeling will be contrary. Let's put it that way. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It is just troubling that we are in
Mm,
2024, headed into 2025, and we are talking about the censorship of fiction and nonfiction. Um,
yes, yes,
yeah, I
yes.
mean, I don't know how, I don't know. It just,
Mm-hmm,
yeah, it's very
mm-hmm.
frustrating. And I texted my niece actually information about this, and she was like, "That's
Ooh.
so weird. Do you think they do that in the UK?" And I was like, "I have no idea, but probably not. Like, not to the
Mm-hmm.
same degree that they do it here, right?"
Yeah, yeah, yep,
But it is very
yeah,
disheartening. But yay,
yeah.
Maryland, or at least your counties uh,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
districts attempt to push back in a systemic way. Love it.
Yeah, yeah, super happy about it. So we'll see where it goes in other areas of my state here, but I thought it was just very cool that it even existed, that you could get such a designation and what that communicates,
Mm-hmm.
to the world. So anyway, I'll save my stance on young people and book banning and parenting for another day, Lisa. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's transition into phase two here, which is not definitely not as upbeat as the rah rah library sanctuaries. So some of you may remember a couple of weeks ago in Missouri, a man named Marcellus Williams was executed for allegedly murdering a young woman back in the late 90s. Um, there just a quick recap, there was no DNA connecting him to the scene. There were a couple of witnesses that said he admitted to it and or talked about it, and that the laptop from the woman, I think, was found in his car. But it was very circumstantial evidence, nothing really solid, and he was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. And there have been a couple of times that his execution was scheduled, and then due to appeals and other delays, it didn't happen. But finally, the governor of Missouri signed that death warrant, and despite an appeal to the state Supreme Court and then up to the US Supreme Court, and despite the fact that there is an extraordinarily high probability that this man was innocent, he was executed a couple of weeks ago. And he is a black man, and the victim, the person who was murdered, was a white woman. So there's definitely a racial component here, and there is evidence to show that the prosecutor on the case also inappropriately struck potential jurors based on their racial identity. So I think it ended up only having one African American person on the jury. And then there was some DNA on the knife, the murder weapon, and they retested it. But what ended up happening was they were hoping that that DNA would show an alternate suspect, but it ended up showing the fingerprints or the DNA of someone at the DA's office, an investigator at the DA's office who had handled that murder weapon several times over. And so that then contaminated the murder weapon, which was one of the pieces that they were hanging their hat on as an opportunity to get the death penalty thrown out. Now, what's interesting here is that the family of the victim had agreed to commute the death penalty and just to life in prison. The prosecutor for the county had wanted to throw out the conviction because acknowledging that there had been irregularities, right? But despite that, and despite public outrage, the governor still went ahead and signed the death warrant. A governor who most likely is anti-choice when it comes to abortion because all life matters, except apparently a likely innocent black man who is on death row. So all life doesn't really matter, does it, Governor Parsons? But so we wanted to just use this as a jumping off point, really, because in many ways, his guilt or innocence, it's not irrelevant, but ultimately, what does it mean that some states still have the death penalty in the United States? As someone who grew up in Britain, I find it barbaric, like it's just unfathomable to me that this would be something that happens, that you're essentially teaching people not to kill people by killing people, like, and we know that there's no efficacy to it, right? It isn't a deterrent. So I don't know, Shaunna, what your thoughts are on all of this, given your identities, given that you grew up in the United States, given that you grew up in Virginia, which presumably, at least when you were growing up, had the death penalty. I don't know about now, but wondering what you're thinking about.
Yeah, let me be clear that it sucks royally, especially given how many falsely convicted Black men there are in this country on a regular basis. So just broadly with the data points there. But also too, when I was speaking of books, if you want to talk about books, when I was in seminary, I read a book that specifically spoke to all of these topics, and it's been a long time. But to your point, Virginia only abolished death penalty in 2021, very recently, right? And so given that, there was a book that I read when I was in seminary called Crossing the River Styx, the memoir of a death row chaplain. And of course, which made complete sense being in Virginia at the time, in seminary at the time, and also having done a little bit of prison ministry while I was in seminary as well. And before reading that book and before going to seminary and before doing prison ministry specifically, yes, I had a very harsh reality of how I felt about uh, the finality of the death penalty. And usually it came from a place of, if this happened to one of my loved ones, then I would want that. Meaning personal vengeance was the name of the game for my thinking pattern, right? And then as the book, Crossing the River Styx, detailed the lack of humanity that was happening in Virginia prisons at the time, the lack of humanity around even the science of the different forms of death penalty, what's allowed and what's not, what they think is humane. And I'm like, there's nothing about this that's humane, not one thing. And some of the things that you think, like, first of all, it's illogical for living people to determine what's humane for someone who then literally crosses the river Styx. You don't know what's painful for them or not. And when the book details, I won't get into all the specifics, but for example, the scientific act that they thought would take less than 5 minutes, taking close to 2 hours of torture for this individual, right? Or individuals that obviously sometimes had family members observing in the moment, and then the trauma that they had to process afterwards, and chaplains trying to support that, right? Even the last words, there's a chapter that's in the book, I think it's the new version of the book. There's an entire chapter that's nothing but the final words of folks, right? And so given that, that really gave me a change of heart on a lot of things. And also at the same time, being a Virginian, being someone who has a particular faith structure that usually is extremely liberal, I feel it is very incoherent and misaligned for human beings to make a determination that we are ill-equipped to make. I feel that should be a decision that's made by the Creator. I think that should be a determination that's made by God in infinite wisdom, but not by human beings. Scientist or not, I don't care about that. And so, given that, I think even with someone who may admit guilt and say, I absolutely did this, I still feel there needs to be a core of humanity. This gentleman made it clear, I did not do this. His family made it clear. Even some of the testimony later on said, no, I absolutely know that this was not the person. In fact, the person that witnessed against him later admitted, and it was a family joke. It was known amongst the family that, no, he really didn't do it. But, I get some type of financial benefit by submitting someone's name. So I just happened to submit this name so that I could get paid and move on. Whereas this person lost their life for doing so. So yeah, it's extremely problematic. The timeline is off. And at the same time, this is another instance in the United States where I'm horrified, yet at the same time, not surprised. Not surprised.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, we know, I mean, for me, it's not about the creator, it's about our criminal legal system is so unjust. And to your point earlier, we know that there are countless African American men, mostly, but not exclusively, people on death row who are likely innocent, right? But the criminal legal system has failed them. Their public defender was useless. Their civil rights were violated. Various access to all of those provisions in the Constitution didn't happen. Juries were messed around with. I mean, we know that. So unless you can have a flawless system where you can guarantee guilt without even a hair of doubt, then there's no place for the death penalty. I mean, I would still say there's no place for the death penalty regardless, right? Because I just think it's barbaric. And we do not have a system that can be sure, right? Because of racism, because of poverty, right? Access to legal counsel. There was this film years ago, Kevin Spacey film, where it was about the death penalty, and a group of anti-death penalty advocates basically set up a murder. So someone was murdered, and they purposely framed Kevin Spacey, who was then convicted and then put to death. But they had filmed the actual murder, and it wasn't Kevin Spacey. It was someone else, or the person took their own life. I forget exactly what it was. And so then they mailed that video to a journalist after Kevin Spacey had been executed. Again, to prove that the system is broken, it's flawed. You basically just murdered an innocent man. And I've never forgotten. I mean, I was already against the death penalty, but I've never forgotten that, right? And then we just hear about these countless times where people are executed. And you know what really gets me with this particular situation, Shaunna, is that you had a prosecutor, so the office of the prosecutor that originally prosecuted Marcellus Williams, not the same prosecutor, but the office, and the family of the victim said, we are in agreement that Marcellus Williams should be removed from death row, should not lose his life. And the Governor Parsons was like, I don't care, right? And you say this is about giving the victim's family peace, and you just completely disregarded their wishes right there, right? So,
Oh
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. It's more about let me flex this power. And I think what's unfortunate, there's so much that's unfortunate about this, but I do recall William's son, of course, pleading at the very last for clemency, of course. And once again, Lisa, we've been past this rock before. I'm sorry, but a jury of 11 white people, one black person, for a black man in this country who I'm assuming, I'm making a grand leaping assumption that he was Muslim as well, because his last words were all praise be to Allah in every situation. I'm sorry, but that jury is nowhere near a reflection of his peers.
Oh, no, absolutely not. Yeah. He
But we've
converted
seen
to
this play
Islam.
before.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Not
So
new.
I guess it's just a thought that we wanted to plant in our listeners' heads around that this continues to be a problem. And the hypocrisy is sky high here. And then what can we do as activists, as advocates, to prevent another person like Marcellus Williams from being executed by the state, right? I don't have a good answer for you, but I just think we need to not forget about this because it's there in the background, and
Mm-hmm.
many states still have the death penalty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we won't even get into I'll dig up the paper one day that I wrote for in seminary after I read this book around even the
Mm.
different types of execution and
Oh,
what that
yeah.
says about the state history.
Yeah.
Well,
We talked
when you're
about that
talking,
a little while ago, too, right? Because
yeah,
there was that whole thing about lethal injection and,
that's right.
oh my God,
That's right.
disgusting. Disgusting.
Exactly. Exactly. So anyway, I am just these are the moments and these are the stories, the real life experiences of people that remind me that I am at my core an empath and very okay with that. Also knowing that I need to create distance because of my empathic responses to things. It could really feel like a hopeless world. Let's just be very clear on that, right? So that's why when it comes to these book sanctuaries and these other glimmers of hope, I have to hold on to them tightly, Lisa, because if not, I'll be like, burn it all down, girl, burn it all down. Which we have also said many times before on this podcast. Start over. But let's get into our last phase. And this one, now you all see it come full circle, y'all. So, Governor Newsom out in California is formally apologizing for its role of slavery, or at least it has been voted that this will occur. There was a 2020 commission that was established by Governor Newsom, and there were a number of recommendations that emerged from that commission, in particular, a formal apology from the state of California, cash reparations, and other forms of support such as education and housing, especially for obviously for Black people that are descendants of enslaved people. And so that bill was passed. And so now it gets really interesting where people can appeal land. And we've actually seen cases of land and even beaches in certain areas in California that used to be fully Black owned that are now being returned to families, communities, and so forth. But what I think is fascinating about this process is that, Lisa, the United States, we're not ones to apologize often. Okay, you can't be the world superpower and apologize for every damn thing. Apparently, okay, there's the U.S. Muscle that we try to flex often. Um, and so when I heard this, I was like, tentatively, "Yay, way to go!" And we all know, Lisa, that the best apology is changed behavior. Um, and in most situations, the goal is how do you make people whole based on what they lost, based on what they never had, based on the possibilities. And that's when we disagree. So even if the whole country agreed that there should be an apology, the whole country ain't agreeing on if reparations should occur, how they should be configured, and in what form should they be delivered, right? So, given that, Lisa, I think it's very interesting to lay that across the history in this country of just flat out not apologizing for shit around here, right? Like, so federally, there's only 5 documented times where the United States has apologized for anything. So shielding a Nazi officer wanted for war crimes, the internment of Japanese citizens during World War II under FDR, the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, the Tuskegee experiment, which we all know is now the foundation of informed consent, and lots of other things when it comes to research and specifically in the medical community. And more recently, to your point that we were talking about, Lisa, the 2008 apology for slavery and Jim Crow. And at the same time, what does this look like when it comes to reparations for Black people specifically? That's when things get interesting, Lisa. So, yeah, I'm tentatively cheering for California, but at the same time, I want to see how the actual apology is playing out beyond the words.
Yeah, I think there's been some criticism that the apology is performative, so we'll include a link directly to the PDF so you can read it. California, it was not a state where enslaving Africans was legal, but they turned their head. They were bystanders that didn't do anything, right? And they enforced the fugitive slave law and a number of other issues that enabled, or at least they became complicit in kind of perpetuating enslavement in other states. And so I think part of the struggle for Californians has been, well, we were not a state that enslaved people. So what is our responsibility in paying reparations when I look to the South, I look to Louisiana, I look to Georgia, I look to Mississippi, and they're doing absolutely jack shit, right? So I think there's some of that happening there. I think this also has fallen at an interesting time politically because one of the critiques of Vice President Kamala Harris is that she is a West Coast California liberal. And so for California to then legislate financial reparations to the descendants of enslaved people would, the perception I think was that would just add fuel to the already simmering, she is quote unquote too radically left for this country, right? So I think that piece has also paid into this. The interesting thing about that eminent domain or the housing piece is because of the land that was given back to that family in California, the beach. I'm forgetting their names, but it happened recently. Bruce's Beach, is that what it was called? There was hope that there would be some movement on a broader, kind of a broader arc, but this is the interesting piece. So a bill did pass the California state legislature giving descendants of enslaved people the right to appeal, review land that had been taken from them. So naturally, not just enslaved people, but if you could show that there was land that was taken from you through eminent domain that was fueled by racism, then there was a process for you to get that land back. But so the bill outlined the process, but did not create the body, the entity that would then hear the reviews, right?
Oh my goodness.
So Gavin Newsom vetoed that bill because he's like, well, we can't implement it. If you don't legislate the body of people that can hear the reviews and then facilitate the return of land, then it is a completely pointless bill. So that was a more meaty attempt to put something with the apology, but they cut out the legs, right? It didn't have any capacity to be implemented because there was no body associated it, which you could
Hmm.
absolutely do in a state law. You could absolutely say, we hereby, require the creation of this particular group to hear these reviews and blah 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 blah.
That's
Right? Like
right.
they could have done that and they didn't. So I
And
thought
they
that was
didn't.
really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I did look it up. Yes, it's Bruce's Beach is exactly the name of it. And um uh, a black couple, Willa and Charles Bruce, purchased that land. And it's been almost 100 years now. So um after they bought the land, 12 years later, they were forced off the property. So they bought it in 1912, were forced off of the land in 1924, and now it's been returned back. So yeah, if you never, create the systems with which to enact, then it is performative. Going back to your point at the top of this phase, it does become performative. And, once again, this goes back to our many conversations, Lisa, around trust, right? It's, you know, hollow promises like this that get
Right. Right.
especially Black people's hopes up about certain things, all to the contrary, right? So, given that, I'm like, oh, yeah, this sucks if it's not going to really be enacted. And at the same time, we know there are systems that don't want it enacted and they want it to be an administrative stroke of the pen that keeps this from actually happening. But the only headline that's going to hit the news is, yay, we got an apology. Did you make life
Right.
better for Black people? Did you try to level the playing field for Black people? Did you even attempt to help Black people catch up on a race that they are 400 years behind on? Did you, or was it just words? And so, with that, Lisa, it very much reminds me of President Obama's last book that was a super long one, but he had a section that was really poignant in it where he talks about the parallel of examples of how this has been done. So, like I mentioned earlier, reparations have been implemented in South Africa. Also, apologies and systems that wrap around apologies have also happened in Germany. Like, if you think about global injustices, Germany and our Jewish siblings are near the top of the doggone list. And so President Obama was trying to make the plea of, if this can occur in comparable global historic situations, why can't it happen here in the US?
Right.
So we have
Right.
models. We have models that could work for us. And at the same time, Lisa, here's my how can I say? Uh, This is my concern that this mm, may still end up being performative, right? Again, think about the realities of attempting to go back to what you were saying before, prove that you are indeed a descendant of enslaved
Yeah.
people when records were not kept thoroughly.
Right. Right.
Then you have a built-in challenge. Or even with there was one census, I was just looking up one census where um some of the records were destroyed in a fire, and so they just destroyed all the records for that year, like shit like that, where
Right.
folks did not want to keep the data up to snuff. And so this is where you have a hard time proving. And I get it, because you have groups of folks, like, for example, this is the challenge with Juneteenth. And I hear my friends all the time who are not, they are Black, but they are not descendants of enslaved people in the United States, that get requests for Juneteenth speeches and all this type of thing. They're like, I can't speak to Juneteenth because my people are not descendants of
Okay.
slavery here in this country. So yeah, I'm Black, but don't lump us all into the monolith. Similarly, you're going to have Black people who don't want reparations because they are not descendants of slaves and will not even attempt to
Right.
go there. And then you have people like myself who genuinely are. And how do we prove it other than going as far back as we can with a almost like the inventory of a store? All I know is this many generations ago, there were three people that came to Browns Island in Richmond, Virginia, from my home country on the continent, and they did not have names. What do you do
Right.
with that?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, she was called Daisy, but we don't know what her name really was because it wasn't documented. But we think her name was Daisy. We don't have birth dates. My grandfather, who would be 100 next year, didn't even have a birthday.
Mm,
So, given that, how do you then prove that you are truly a descendant without some resistor trying to prove otherwise?
yeah. Yeah, and we're already seeing resistors, right? So
Yeah.
Evanston, Illinois, outside of
Oh,
Chicago,
mhm.
they are the first American city to establish a reparations program. So they offer eligible Black descendants housing grants for past discriminatory housing practices and segregation. I do not know how they are determining, to your point just now,
Yeah.
but a
Yeah.
conservative group is suing Evanston, Illinois, saying that the
Never
program
fails.
discriminates against non-black residents. To which I have a lot of expletives to say because I am like, because non-black residents were not are not descendants of enslaved people. So the program is not for you. It is not for you. So anyway, that was my little outburst. I apologize.
No, no, no. Don't apologize. Don't apologize. But they don't get it, Lisa. They don't get it. They don't get it. Oh, Lord. Well,
Yeah. Hmm.
but we knew it though. We call see this is the issue right here, Lisa, that you and I deal with on a regular basis when it comes to our DEI work. We are frustrated by the resistors, yet at the same time, they are predictable as the clock on the wall. We know they're going to show up. We know they're going to have some shit to say. We know that they're going to make it difficult to make things right. We know that they are like on full-time payroll to do this shit. Okay, we know this. And so, given that, from a Gavin Newsom perspective, how do you bake it into your apology, your reparations, whatever hinges off of the apology? How do you bake in the anticipated response to the resistors that you know will rear their ugly heads? Because they are coming. They're coming. And that's not
They
negative.
are.
That's not
Right. Right.
that's not pessimistic. That is the track record for anything that's tried to right a historical wrong. It is a track record that resistors will come and try to make themselves relevant. The reason why you don't get reparations with housing is because this is not relevant to you. This is not your heritage. This is not your lineage. So you don't need it. And so, Lisa, it goes
Mm,
back to what we were saying before with affirmative action before that was struck down and everything else. It, the greatest example I've seen in a meme, this was years ago, where this person was kind of ranting and raving about, well, why didn't the fire truck come to my house? Because your house isn't on fire. Your
mm-hmm.
neighbor's house is on fire. You
Right.
don't need a fire truck. The neighbor needs a fire truck. And so, given that, I realize that again, the resistors try to make themselves relevant in a world in which they are not relevant. The same way that Justice Roberts tried to say,
Mm-hmm.
well, ideally, we shouldn't need this. We are not in the ideal. You, white man, have always been in the ideal. But
Right.
as far
Right.
as the rest of us, we do
Yep.
not live in that ideal that you are writing your opinion from. It's disappointed yet not surprised over and over and over again, Lisa.
Over and over again. Yeah. And
Mhm.
I do want to, we are, do you had the example of South Africa and Germany, and we are capable of reparations because in 1948, Congress provided $38 million in reparations to folks who had been interned, Japanese people who had been interned. And then 40 years after that, so 1988, they paid an additional 20 grand to each surviving individual who had been detained in the camp. So we are capable of providing financial
Yeah, yeah,
reparations, right? That's a
yeah,
smaller number of people, obviously, but
yeah.
in this climate where we're now suing a reparations program because I, white person, don't get to have any of those reparations, right? Like,
Right,
I
right,
I
right, right.
don't see how we could get there, but we've done it.
Mm-mm.
The US has done it, right? There is
Well,
an
yeah,
example.
yeah. Well, and I know it feels a little bit tangential, Lisa, but you know, it feels like the same tenor and tone as all the people that are frustrated by student loan forgiveness without acknowledging a history of being disenfranchised and excluded from higher ed, number one, and number two, from access to finances for anything, but especially education. It feels like that same tenor, like the amount of people that are pissed off that I gratefully and thankfully was forgiven $207,000. Yeah, there's some people that are pissed off about that. I consider it my personal reparations at the very least. If I don't get another penny from anywhere ever again, partially because history. I will not forget history.
Right.
Never.
Right.
Just won't. It's relevant. And it's not to say it's not to play victim, yet at the very same time, it is part of the baked in
Mm-hmm.
framework of this country that we could not extract even if we wanted to. Can't do it.
Right.
It's part of who we are.
It is. Very much so.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah.
on that uplifting note, let's wrap it up. um, where can folks find us if they want to engage in these really uplifting conversations?
Right. If they want to look, if they want to hang out with us and pontificate over everything that's on fire, I think something around fire needs to be the name of this podcast, Lisa, because everything's either on fire or we're going to set it on fire and start over. But for those that are still listening to us, make sure that you certainly subscribe to us on YouTube at Unfazed Unedited. Certainly subscribe and follow us at Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify. Instagram, we're there as well. We announce every week our podcast and all the phases, so you can listen from beginning to end, or you can skip around to your favorite topic if you so choose. LinkedIn, as well as unfazedpodcast.com, where you can find our old and our new shows. Lisa, I cannot believe that we are slowly but surely creeping up on the 200s. I think this is
Yep, we are.
164-ish.
Yep,
So I
yep.
can't believe that we're there. So there's lots of archives for you all to rifle through. So please, if you liked this week's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, share with your friends, coworkers, or anyone in this phase of your life. So, Dr. Lisa, we got to find something uplifting for next week, right?
We do. We do. Yeah.
All right.
I'm on
Until
it.
then.
I'm on it.